I am reporting on a project that we have done, which we call RDCO, where we worked in part with funding from, Hordaland County, now Vestland County, basically on mostly the contractual and financial aspects of decommissioning. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly through things that I just want to kind of inform you about, know what is there, and then I'm going to emphasize what I think are some intriguing puzzles and important things to focus on from the point of view of economics. And that's in part because many believe that economists, all they can do is to add revenues and costs and see whether things make money or not. And that's kind of what we do, but we do a little bit more than that. So here's a copy of the front page of the report that we did, which was with a cooperation between us here at NHH and the Law Institute, where the main protagonist has been Ignacio Herrera Anchustegui, and we have worked well together. So this was not mostly emphasizing materials of decommissioning and so on, but rather the incentive structures and the regulatory framework. So we have been studying the main implications of decommissioning, and this has been petroleum and wind, but I'll try to emphasize the wind part as opportunity is given. Some facts and figures. A brief story is that decommissioning in the North Sea is a huge mountain of work that is sailing towards us. And much of this is oil and gas. But a reason to look at it together with wind is that A, wind hasn't really started yet in terms of quantities, and B, if we make some important experiences in general, then of course they are perhaps most beautifully applied when we look at the sector which is just starting, because it could be that we shall design for recommissioning and decommissioning and circularity, and it could be that we shall, when we look at the regulatory framework and financial framework, that we shall be more cognizant of what implications it has for the quality of recommissioning and decommissioning. So there's lots of this in the Gulf of Mexico, but there very many installations are small. And there are lots of this, of course, in our part of the world, not that many in numbers, but they are in general larger. And we believe, or everybody believes, that in terms of wind in the oceans, both to the bottom and floating, standing on the bottom and floating, is going to grow very fast in our time. So it's an interesting question, what it takes to place this in a sensible framework. Only 4 offshore wind farms have been decommissioned in Europe, and the countries that we looked at, only 1, and that was in Denmark. So I said it is a big mountain of work coming towards us. And so here are some numbers underpinning that, but you'll see that also in the coming slides. So when we look at removal, a very important part of it for us as business people and economists and lawyers or whoever defines the regulatory framework is that this is clearly stated as an obligation. When you get to build a factory, you also sign for an obligation to clean up after yourself. That's a very important part of this. Key regulatory features are who has to decommission, and typically it's the owner or operator. In my view, this is pretty impressive in the sense that it doesn't look like doubts about who has this obligation is a very prominent feature. It does look like it's pretty clear, but we will see that there are some wrinkles in this. But in comparison to some other industries, I would say this is basically looks quite well designed from the start. So if you use the word obligation, you will also use the word liability. And as liabilities, these are, in my view, pretty firm, especially in the sense that, for instance, if you look at the balance sheet of an oil company, you will see that they have been allowed to and asked to set aside funds for decommissioning or recommissioning. And that means that if you are an investor and look at a company like Equinor, you can see this obligation or this liability in a way similar to what would be a debt obligation, similar to owing some other parties money. You are owing in your license an obligation to clean up. Now, a key part of the regulatory framework here, of course, when we're talking about the North Sea, is that this is not only a national issue, so it's partly bound by international treaties. Again, I would say if you look at this, you'll probably discover some flaws, but you'll also kind of learn that there is a framework here. It's not a free-for-all. It's not anarchy. Here's a little bit of development. There is the 1958 Convention of Continental Shelves. There is a 1972 London Convention. There is UNCLOS of 1982. And one thing that you will discover, because it's kind of interesting and operative in the sense that you can see it, is the OSPAR Convention of 1992, and especially its decision 98.3. So we have regulations both for oil installations, and oil and gas installations, and for wind, but of course they have been less tested, and I think are also less specific, and definitely when it comes to wind in Norway. But for wind, the principle is to restore the area as it was. So this sounds like full removal. I think we believe that this will become more specific, and you will see why I think this is quite pressing. And it's not only because we're going to build a lot of wind farms in our time in the world, offshore wind farms in our time in the world, but also because wind has a different feature from petroleum, and that is mostly these wind projects have a shorter lifetime. And when they have a shorter lifetime, they are more influenced by the cleanup obligation. So in a way, work to specify the cleanup obligation and perhaps also the option value of the wind farm at its closure are pretty urgent to develop. Here's an exposition of this mountain of work coming. And as you can see, for the top sides, it's something like 2 million tons of work coming towards us. And if you think of that in terms of a huge structure like the deck of Statfjord A, which is about 50,000 tons, you realize that's only a very small part of the total here. So the amount of work, and I think we can say it looks like we're not really prepared for the amount that comes towards us. The amount is tremendous. So a traditional approach to circularity from the point of view of economics and management, so this is in a way where we start, is that from the point of view of business and economics, we do not start by saying that a waste stream is anything special. A waste stream should be and will be exploited with the same enthusiasm and approach as we approach mining and forestry. So basically, you would pick what's valuable out of such a waste stream according to quite normal profitability requirements or processes, and we'll go through that in a little bit detail. A little wrinkle to that, present in the literature, is that it might be that virgin materials and pollution is underpriced. So that's kind of a regulatory flaw. And if so, you will see such things as taxes, regulations, deposit refund schemes, etc., including perhaps government efforts in recycling and reuse itself. So if you, for instance, take the Norwegian deposit refund scheme for bottles, it may look like the market mechanism, and in fact it is a market mechanism, but it is instigated by government requirements. Otherwise, recycling of bottles in Norway would be much lower than what you're actually seeing. So here's a very brief summary of our findings in this RDCO project, or the sub-project that's called pre-decor. One, this is waste. It's waste with pearls in it, but mainly the main feature is that this is an obligation. So it's not something that the vultures are circling around it, really eager to hack into it. No, it's an obligation of the owner of the oil exploration, and they're looking for ways to deliver on or discard or send to somebody else this obligation. The obligated owners are putting too little smartness into it, and some reasons for that is that they are risk averse, and it is risky to be creative. They also do it ad hoc, so maybe there is insufficient competence and knowledge put into this because it's looked at as one project at a time rather than as an enormous job coming towards us. And perhaps, and that's an important point, perhaps potential improvements would be in large part other people's gains. So, you know, it is possible, an asymmetry here, that if you are looking at special ways of doing decommissioning of your oil infrastructure or wind assets, part of what happens is that you're discovering some environmental damage, for instance, which actually expands your obligation. So obviously, you're not very eager to find hidden problems. And that may be an important part of the problem with decommissioning in the North Sea. Now, here's a chart that we made thinking about an oil project. Thinking about an oil project, you would probably have something like 4 decades of operation and positive cash flow. And you earn those 4 decades of positive cash flow by investing in the beginning and by paying for decommissioning towards the end. And when you have such a long period as this, so I did this as, you know, the midpoints of 5 decades or of 6 decades, so that spans over 5 decades, is that when you're looking towards decommissioning as you are starting the project, decommissioning is worth almost nothing. In this case, decommissioning, the cost of decommissioning changes the profitability of the project from something like 6.5% to a margin between 6.2% and 6.8%. So this is basically because you have a cost of capital which is positive, variations, and here I have taken a variation in this decommissioning cost of perhaps it doesn't cost anything because there is as much value in it as it costs to exploit it, or perhaps it is as costly as the investment was, or perhaps it's twice that's costly. So you can see that's quite an enormous variation that I've put into it, into the uncertainty of the decommissioning. And when you're starting the project, you don't care much. So that's an important part of understanding the incentive structure. You're not going to worry a lot about what happens 55 years ahead when you are investing if you have a positive cost of capital. In this structure, it's also the case that as the project proceeds, so maybe you're in the 4th decade or even in the 5th decade, now you're actually planning for the decommissioning, and the rest of the project has a negative net cash flow. So at that point, you're really worrying about how to make this cost as little as possible. And perhaps you're going to try to invest in de-emphasizing environmental costs or something like that. So the way the incentives for the operator changes through the project cycle is very important when you have as long a time span as this. Now let's look at the wind farm. And my projecting, or my idea about the wind farm, is really exactly the same as this, but it has a shorter lifetime. So then it looks like this. Wind farms now look like they're going to live for 25 years. So that's somewhere between 20 years to the right in this figure, or 30 years to the left in this figure. And the first thing that you discover when you make this variation on the project cash flow is that, well, the project is then less profitable. Why is that? Well, it is because we took away a decade or two of positive cash flow. So it's less profitable. Secondly, even in the beginning, the decommissioning costs are much more important. So a difference in wind from petroleum is that there is a greater likelihood that people will think about decommissioning if they realize they have to do it when they design and when they build, simply because there are not that many decades before you actually have to do it. So for shorter lifespans, the tendency to think about it later diminishes. So you're going to think about it now when you're building. It's going to influence, or it might influence, the design phase, or at least that's something that we should expect and that we may hope for. Secondly, a greater policy concern regards what is in the decommissioning. So for instance, if decommissioning is given a wrong emphasis, either too high or too low in the beginning, it's going to be a greater real problem for shorter term projects. And that's simply because the consequences are nearer in time, and decommissioning should influence the design phase more for near-term projects than for long-term projects. Now, if we look at this, if you bid for a job to pick apart or clean up from a license, you're delivering the services to somebody who has the project. What are going to be your concerns? Well, one of them is circularity. You're going to ask yourself, how valuable are the parts, for instance, in recommissioning? Secondly, you're going to think about how much does it cost to cut this apart, to transport it, and perhaps, if it's not very useful stuff, to deliver it for safe disposal. Thirdly, you're going to ask yourself, and perhaps somebody else has asked, what are the ecological values? So, if we're not removing this fully, what are the environmental costs, or what are the costs to other sectors and other activities? And thirdly and fourthly, what are the regulatory uncertainties? So, if we spend some resources on this early, perhaps in creative, circular ways of doing this, it is also a costly and risky fight to have these new ideas accepted. So these are, in a way, the themes that show up when you think about A, how to do a decommissioning, and B, how to regulate an activity in which decommissioning is an important part. And as I have stated earlier, if you compare to some other industries, it looks to us, and I think we have dug at least a little bit deeply into it, it looks to us like this removal obligation is a fairly firm obligation. It's not easy to escape it, and the actors in this industry are thinking about it carefully. So, one example of that is that if you're looking at an oil company, you will see that this is treated more or less like a debt obligation when they report to other creditors and to investors and to regulators the state of their business. They know that they have to clean up, and if they try to wriggle away from it, it's not an easy task. The protection argument is an important in this removal obligation. And the original argument is that you want to protect the current seabed. Now, it is also the case, and especially for long-term projects, that that everything has changed. Technology has changed. Even the seabed has changed. So it is possible that when you are approaching decommissioning, you're going to try the argument with the authorities that this thing cannot be removed. And then the question is, can a commitment from regulators to stand by a complete removal obligation, can that commitment be sustained? Or are regulators too weak and perhaps open-minded? Open-minded might mean the same as weak in this context. That's a little bit provocative. In Norwegian policy and some other Western countries, if you do social cost benefit analysis, we are advised to look at very long-term projects with lower social discount rates. And that basically means that this lower social discount rate allows you to put greater weight than you otherwise would on years that are pretty distant ahead of us. But of course, the fact that we can do that in government doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that it is done in private sector. So we have to be aware that in private sector, and not the least in a business like like energy business, that investors and managers will discount the future at fairly heavy rates. Now, as it happens, the problem is in part resolved as we approach decommissioning. But of course, the benefit of having thought carefully about decommissioning in the early years will still have been diminished by the higher cost of capital or discount rates that are used in the private sector. So that's a possible reason for heavy regulation in this area. And I would say what we are seeing here, to me, can be characterized as fairly firm government regulation to protect the public interest. Now, we economists have a puzzle that engages us quite a lot, and that is called time-consistent policy, and I have touched on it. Time-consistent policy is a policy that will be sustained even when circumstances change over time. And I would say in this setting of decommissioning in wind and in petroleum, we have to be aware that it may not be sufficient that the obligation is stated clearly in the outset, because if the world changes sufficiently, then perhaps government and regulators will look at it with fresh eyes when decommissioning is approaching. And if they do, it will be a discussion about how much of a removal, if it is costly, is actually worth doing. So, if somebody argues that this rig can actually be left in place and it's going to be good for cod and good for fish and good for tourism, and it will not do much harm to leave it there, then we all know that they are arguing this in part because they don't want to remove it. And we should know that that argument may win. So this is a very important puzzle to us, important provocation, one could say. But in the end, the part of decommissioning which isn't worth it or cannot really be argued to be worth it will be raised later in the project. That discussion will be raised later in the project, and it's sensible for us to ask what resistance can be provided when that discussion comes. In my view, investing in ecological knowledge is a very important part of retaining or of building that commitment. So a very important question is whether there is firmness in the political economy and in the regulatory framework. This commitment problem, can you stand by your regulatory firmness, is very well described. Here are two from the popular literature. One is from Stanley Kubrick's film, 1964, Dr. Strangelove, where he asks, are you telling me you created a doomsday machine and you didn't tell anybody? And if we look at even further behind in history, in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus is tying his hands to the mast in order not to be able to deviate from the course of his journey. And in modern social science terms, this means that then the sirens will not try to tempt him. So in other words, if you can tie your hands, there may be very big gains. And I think that what we are seeing in decommissioning in the North Sea is in a way questions about the extent to which we can tie our hands to sustain a cleanup obligation. So part of our argument ends with saying there is an inescapable need for competence in the host. And that means perhaps the Norwegian government or the governments around the North Sea need to invest in competence about ecological consequences, so that when the battle comes about these things are not worth removing, or we can only remove them halfway or something like that, we really have the knowledge necessary to argue either that that's fine with the environment, it's fine with ecology, it's fine with fishers, it's fine with tourism, or to say, no, it's not fine. We do want to do this cleanup in this way or that way. So that competence in the host is going to be both how can we get the most out of recommissioning and decommissioning, how can we create a sustainable business out of it, and how can we take care of the North Sea for future generations. So then we have pointed out, I think, mostly questions for the future. What is required in the incentive framework, in the regulations, if we are to do this decommissioning and recommissioning in such a way that we get maximum out of it in terms of circularity and maximum out of it in terms of ecological protection. Thank you.